All right, music fans, welcome back. Harmless Dave here, talking real music in real time for real people just like you and just like me. Chicago, the band, there's an interview on their website with Jimmy Pankow and Lee Loughnane, two-thirds of the legendary horn section, which even to this day misses Walt Perizader, who left the band because of a heart condition. And recently we found out that Walt also has Alzheimer's. So um, unfortunately, Walt's off the road and probably won't be back with the band. It'll be interesting to see if he records with the band because Chicago is working on new material. It was confirmed in this article. And Jim Peterick, who I had on this show, told me that he was working with Chicago, writing songs, and hopefully doing some production or some other things, because I think Chicago kind of needs a shot in the arm as far as their studio material goes, but we'll see. But what's interesting about this article, narratives, you know how I am about narratives, right? When I see a narrative start to take shape, and this narrative has been going on for quite some time, there's a portion of the article where they start talking about the 1980s. Obviously, the tragic and unexpected death of Terry Kath sent Chicago into a tailspin. Hot Streets, which I think is a pretty decent album, Chicago 13, which was leaning too heavily toward disco probably, and Chicago 14, produced by the late great Tom Dowd, who was probably better at producing Southern rock and a different style of music than Chicago. At that point, the band had run out of gas and nobody in the group was really happy. Coming along later to help was Irving Azoff, who signed the band to his new record label called Full Moon Records. And then he sent David Foster in to help rescue the band. Lee Loughnane says Foster was a new producer. David was fairly new, but he was already really established, and his production methods were meticulous. It was always ear candy with David Foster, even if the material itself wasn't that strong. You put on headphones and listen to something recorded with Foster at the helm, and it's probably going to sound really good. Lee Loughnane says that Foster's method was to pick one voice within the ensemble, as he called it. Now you've got obviously Peter Cetera, Robert Lamb, Bill Champlin was in the group at that point. By the way, Champlin joins at the same time that Foster joins. And to me, this was the second wave of Chicago. Those of you who grew up in the 80s know what I'm talking about. You went back and you listened to all of the first wave material, and the second wave stuff got you into the first wave stuff. For those Chicago people, and I remember them, who were into the first wave of Chicago, they hated the second wave of Chicago, thought it didn't sound anything like Chicago, thought it was a sellout, thought the band had become too ballad-oriented and too poppy and too slick and so forth. But folks, it was the 1980s, and David Foster was the perfect guy to rescue this band. At this point, the band wanted to be successful. Chicago 16 comes out. Hard to Say I'm Sorry goes to number one. Peter Cetera and David Foster form a songwriting duo, and the rest, as they say, is history. But this is interesting here because it appears that Lee and Jimmy are doing a little revisionist history here. They don't talk about Bill Champlin because his voice was very important on these call and answer ballads where Cetera would sing a line and then Champlin would sing a line. Later on, Jason Scheff and Bill Champlin would do that on songs. And then Champlin became very important toward the end of the 80s, singing lead vocals on Chicago's fastest number one song. It's a Diane Warren song, and I don't think that went over too well with the old school band members. Number one, to have a song go to number one that quickly. Number two, an outside writer who was really hot at the time. And number three, you got Bill Champlin on lead vocals. And we're talking about Look Away, by the way, which ended the decade. That was actually, if you go back on Billboard and look, the top song of 1989, most charts have Look Away as the top song of 1989, which is rather ironic because Foster wasn't producing at that time and the band was relying on outside songwriters. Actually, all of those top 10 songs from Chicago 19, all of those songs were outside writing, and I think they're all Diane Warren songs. So it's pretty interesting. In any event, so Azoff comes in, he brings in Foster. According to Loughnane and Pankow, he focused just on Peter Cetera. If you go back and watch the documentary about Chicago, as Peter Cetera calls it, the mockumentary or the schmockumentary, I don't know. He used a word that, he made up. He didn't appreciate it. And the documentary basically says that nobody had any songs. Foster said, hey, nobody had any songs. He went to Peter. Peter was disgruntled, but he had songs, and they decided to work together. And saying that Foster just wanted to focus on Peter Cetera's voice, that might be true, but the other guys weren't inputting. And I'm talking specifically about Robert Lamb. Bill Champlin had songs, and songs that he wrote got on to both Chicago 16, 17, 18, and I think even Chicago 19. The issue that I think Foster had was the lack of enthusiasm, the lack of focus, and the band was going through a rough patch when they got to Chicago 16. But he goes on to say, we let David pick the songs and he made the album. Well, that's what producers do. They produce the album. He goes on to say, but he didn't allow Jimmy to do any brass arrangements and he ended up overproducing us. Ooh, all right. So that's kind of a big line in this interview, that David Foster supposedly overproduced Chicago. The period between Chicago 16 and Chicago 18 was a very strong period, and Chicago 17, in 1984, Chicago 17 was the radio, all right? And yes, Peter Cetera ballads, You're the Inspiration, Hard Habit to Break, those songs are the songs that still are on the radio and are bread and butter as far as Chicago's catalog, and those songs will last hundreds of years. And that's a combination of both Cetera and Foster and really great production. That was perfect for the 1980s and still holds up pretty well today. If you're thinking he overproduced the band for the era and so forth that music came out in, I strongly disagree. I think David Foster was the perfect remedy for what ailed Chicago. Now, did it pull Chicago away from its jazzy jam band roots from the 70s? Yeah, but the band had already meandered away from that on albums that came out post Terry Kath. All of that material was far less Chicago 2 or Chicago 3 and more like, hey, we're trying to write these individual songs that will get airplay. We're not writing a suite. We're not writing a complex arrangement. We're trying to go for the radio. And what I think is interesting here is to say that Foster overproduced and got rid of the brass. Well, that's not always the case as well. Along Comes a Woman on Chicago 17 has an amazing horn part in it, which was perfect when you were playing dance music or whatever. It worked. Foster knew when to incorporate it. He knew what instruments, whether it was a flute or whether it was, some hard brass. Foster knew how much to use. In the documentary, he kind of made a joke of it, saying that, Peter Cetera would come in and turn all the horns down, and the horn players would come in and turn all the horns up. And that might have been true. But the reason the band was successful wasn't because there were lots of horns or there weren't lots of horns. It got worse, by the way, when they got to Chicago 19. There were very few horns on that record, and the label did not want horns. All right. They knew in 1989 rock bands were more muscular. They weren't really jazzy. And I know that didn't fit the Chicago mold, but it worked again. If you want to look at album sales and how well the charts were going for Chicago in 1989, one could make the argument that getting rid of the horns wasn't a bad thing. But here's the deal. If you're a Chicago fan, obviously you want horns. I get it. But I think this interpretation here by Lee and Jimmy is a little over the top by saying that David overproduced them. I don't think that's true. I think Foster has a tendency to want to do every bell and whistle when it comes to production, but those albums were really successful. Even when Cetera left, Foster stuck around for Chicago 18, and you can argue again that the band kept some of that forward momentum with Jason Scheff, even though it was still a huge blow to the franchise. And these guys to this day, it's kind of like when the Monkees admitted that writing their own songs didn't help their career, even though they were pretty good songs. They had this stable of amazing songwriters who were writing just amazing hit songs. And why would you mess with that? Well, you want control and you want to do it yourself, and you don't want to admit. Look, anybody who doesn't want to admit that David Foster isn't a brilliant producer and somebody who's achieved things that many other producers haven't. And look, Foster is a little bit stuck on himself, for sure. In the documentary, he's basically like, hey, I know I'm good. He's got a lot of self-confidence. And to turn that band around on one record, to have such a long drought, and then, Hard to Say I'm Sorry, which if it's coupled with Getaway, and the guys in the band love to talk about Getaway because that's a little piece that they were able to kind of put in there and pair it with that song. And those two pieces really don't go together, but they sound great together. It's weird. I mean, when I hear that song, I want to hear Hard to Say I'm Sorry and Getaway. A lot of stations, even today, just fade it out and they don't let you hear Getaway. But again, it's creativity, because creativity, typically there's tension, and one guy is arguing for more of this, the other guy is arguing for more of that, and you reach a consensus. And typically what happens is the best of everything comes out. And I think the albums that Foster produced, those albums, they do stand the test of time. Their earlier material, like the Chicago Original Greatest Hits album, which was mostly William Guercio, that's all stuff that will also stand the test of time. But complaining about David Foster and him overproducing you, I'm not buying it. There were so many people in the 80s that loved that Chicago 16, 17, 18 sound. Chicago 19, a bit of a bookend, different production, crunchier production, even less when it comes to horns. Ron Nevison on Chicago 19, I think, did a brilliant job. And Bill Champlin, who doesn't even get an honorable mention throughout this, as he never does in a Chicago article. And this is what I mean by revision. Acknowledge Bill, acknowledge David, acknowledge Peter. I mean, these guys were super important to that second wave of Chicago, which, again, crested too quickly. The 90s were coming anyway, and the likes of Chicago were not going to survive when it comes to getting on the radio. These guys had an album that Warner wouldn't release. They released it later. And listening to it, even though I think it's good and it's creative and interesting, I could see why Warner wouldn't want to release the album. They said, go back and do another one. And then eventually they came out with like a big band album 2 years later. It was called Stone of Sisyphus, and it did come out. And there are some good tracks on that, but look at that compared to what Foster was doing with Cetera in the band and the creativity and the songwriting. And yeah, if you're going to complain about ballads, ballads started in the mid 70s with Peter. Peter started writing songs. They were really amazing songs. You had female fans that were really getting into Chicago. To this day, my wife, her favorite music from Chicago is all that 16, 17, 18, 19 stuff that was very ballad oriented. And some stuff like Stay the Night and Along Comes a Woman, which is upbeat. I mean, this is kind of, again, sort of a blanket criticism of David Foster. If I'm Chicago, I'm thanking David Foster for keeping that publishing, for keeping that songwriting revenue going, because every soft rock station in this country, even now, worth its salt, is playing You're the Inspiration, Hard Habit to Break, and Hard to Say I'm Sorry. And even Will You Love Me, right? I mean, it's Will You Still Love Me, which was the Jason Scheff sort of big single debut on Chicago 18. And again, Foster did a masterful job. Think of the time period of 85 and 86 and how music was, and everything was a synthetic drum or a synthesizer. I think Foster, you couldn't ask for a better producer for that moment. So in any event, it's a little bit of revisionist history. And all the eras of Chicago were interesting, other than maybe the last 10 or 15 years, which have gotten a little bit slow. And I think these guys probably could have put out the kind of music they wanted to, but they realized that there is not a lot of revenue right now in music, and touring is better. But just acknowledge that the music of David Foster and his production certainly kept your career alive for at least another decade. That's the way I look at it. So that's my video. And thanks for watching. A little bit long-winded on this one. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell for notifications. And don't forget, on Patreon for $1 a month, $2 a month, $10 a month, $200. No, just kidding. $200 a month. I would need a rock star to sponsor the channel. Maybe there's a rock star out there, although a lot of rock stars right now don't have any money because they haven't been out on tour. So, and there may be a few rock stars that wouldn't want to give to the channel because I'm busting on them all the time. But I do appreciate the music of Chicago, even though I have a bit of a criticism here on their view about David Foster. All right, I am done. That's enough. See you soon.